Welcome back. In this session, we are going to look at querying the Parquet files. So what I have done is I've taken the same CSV data for trip data and I produced an equal and Parquet folder. So if you go into the Parquet folder, you'll see a similar structure to what you saw with the CSV folders, which is the year folder. And then you've got the month folders, and within the month folder you will see the Parquet files. So here you've only got one Parquet file, but in most of the projects you'll see more than one Parquet file. And the only other difference between the CSV files and this is that you've got three of the files here, which are the started, committed, and the success. And these files are created by Parquet process, which created the Parquet file, and they could simply be ignored. And when we come to use Serverless SQL Pool to read the Parquet file, the parser does know to ignore those files so they won't be accounted for any processing. So let me click on the Parquet file and then create a new SQL script to select the top 100 rows. And this is how the SQL looks. It's quite simple compared to the CSV one. As you can see, we got the format, but there is no kind of parser versions or anything like that. And let me execute this and see what happens. And as you can see, the data has been selected already and it's even identified the head records. So when you are looking at a Parquet file, normally a Parquet file contains metadata as well as data. So it keeps metadata about the columns and the data types and all of that as well. So the open row set function with the format Parquet knows that it needs to get the metadata from the file itself, and it does that, and that's how it's displaying the header records. This kind of automatic schema inference provided by the open row set function is really useful when you have a data analyst or a data scientist trying to explore the data quickly as the next step. Let's make some changes to this SQL. First, let's specify use statement. Let's start with changing to use the data source rather than the full part, because that's what we have been doing so far. Also, let me remove the file name here because, as I said, actually, most of the time you're going to have multiple Parquet files and you want to be reading the folder rather than individual files. So I'm going to just simply remove the Parquet file name from here. So it reads all of the files within that folder. And now let's look at the data types being inferred by Synapse and see how good they are. And we know that in order to do it, we need to use the stored procedure to do it. Let's use the stored procedure. I have already written the stored procedure to save our time. Let's run this stored procedure and see the result. And we got error here as we haven't changed the database context over here. So let's switch it to NYC Taxi Discovery by executing the use statement. Now we have switched to NYC Taxi Discovery. Next, let's execute select statement after that. Now it's time to execute the stored procedure to check the data types of each fields. So let's run it by selecting the stored procedure statement. Integer rather than a big int, because if you remember, with the CSV file, it only had two data types. One is big int and the other is a string. So here it's done a better job, and that's because it's inferring the data types from the Parquet metadata. Save the Parquet metadata said it's an integer, it's pulling out and giving you the equal and type in Synapse, which is integer. And similarly, we got the date time being identified correctly as well. But one thing you may notice is that actually a string field has been given as varchar 8000. And we know this is just a flag. Actually, it's just a one-character flag, but it's given us a varchar 8000. So even though it's given us a really good data type, for most of the fields, we've got some strings which are still being identified as large strings rather than the ones we need. So if you are running a query over and over again, it is better to define the data types yourself. Let's do that. So just to save some time, I've already prepared the with clause, and this is how I have defined it. Everything else you may notice is exactly the same as what Synapse inferred them to be, except for the flag, which is a correct to one field. So let me run that to make sure actually it runs okay. That's a run through fine. And we've got the data as we expected, and I don't think there'll be any warnings here either. So that's brilliant. The next thing I want to take you through is the advantage of having a columnar data format and how to make use of it to save cost as well as performance. As Parquet being a columnar format, you can get much better performance if you want to select the columns required. For example, let's say we only needed the trip amount and trip type. There is no point in selecting all of the fields. So when you select the trip type and trip amount because it's a column in a format, the query engine behind the scenes knows that one needs to go and get data from those particular columns, and these files being in column format. It'll just scan the appropriate columns and give us that data so it doesn't have to scan the entire file to get the data we need. Let me demonstrate that. So as you can see here, we've done a top 100 on this file, which is the January 2020 file, and we've selected every single column here. But instead, if we select one lady, 2 columns we talked about, the data being scanned will be smaller. In order to prove that, let's make a note of the data scanned from this query, which is 6 megabytes. So let's run it with only the 2 columns. And now let's run this select statement through and it should select the right data, which is the trip amount and trip type. But the data scanned should be much less so. As you can see, it's only megabyte. 1 megabyte. I think it's even less than 1 megabyte, but it normally around up to 1 megabyte actually. So that's the minimum you can get. So as you can see, we've selected less amount of data and also the performance will be much quicker. You probably won't see the execution time changing much, but when you're working with a large amount of data, you're going to see that. So when you're working with Serverless SQL, it's always better to specify the with clause with the appropriate columns. And also the important thing to remember is if you only need a certain columns for your calculations, only select those columns. It may not make a huge difference when it comes to things like CSV files, because that's a text file. You'll have to scan the entire file in order to get those appropriate columns. But especially when you're working with columnar formats like Parquet or Delta, it's going to make a huge difference. So please remember that in mind. And before we forget, let's give this script a meaningful name, and I'm going to make it consistent with all the other scripts we've got. So that will be called 8_explore trip data green_parquet. And let's move the script into the appropriate folder as well. So that's all done, and let's click publish, and that's the end of this session. I'll see you in the next one.